Hello and welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast, the place where you can hear writers talk about their work, their lives, and the inspiration behind their writing. I'm Claudia, the treasurer on the committee, and today I'm delighted to be introducing the inspiring Abbas Nazari, speaking about his book, After the Tampa. We were thrilled to have Abbas as our guest for the opening event of the 2022 Marlborough Book Festival. Abbas was 7 years old when his family fled the Taliban in Afghanistan, hoping to find a new home in Australia. The journey that followed, including a sinking fishing boat, heroic rescue by the Tampa container ship, and doors closed by the Australian government, caught the world's attention. More than 20 years after the Nazari family was resettled in New Zealand, Abbas is a prominent advocate for refugees, was a semi-finalist for the 2022 Young New Zealander of the Year, and author of the best-selling memoir, After the Tampa. This is the first podcast from the 2022 Marlborough Book Festival. Every fortnight we will share sessions from this year's event, all the way through to the 2023 Marlborough Book Festival. For now, please enjoy Abbas Nazari speaking to Paula Morris.
I can't think of a better segue than that. That was incredible.
Especially it was about refugees. It's very appropriate. Kia ora, Gavin. Kia ora, everyone. I am Paula Morris. It's my pleasure to be here tonight and to be interviewing Abbas Nazari. I've written a very short introduction for him because I figure if you didn't know he was here, you wouldn't be here. So Abbas left Afghanistan, as you all know, at the age of 7. And after facing many trials and political deadlocks and the shenanigans of the Australian government, became a New Zealand, refugee here in New Zealand, a resident, then a citizen, a spelling bee almost champion, and a Fulbright scholar. He's also written a brilliant book, After the Tampa, From Afghanistan to New Zealand, that we'll be discussing tonight. Abbas, you say that you gave this book, your name is on the cover, but the story belongs to all of the 433 asylum seekers who were rescued from drowning in the Indian Ocean by the Norwegian container ship, the Tampa, in 2001. So tonight we're going to talk. Abbas says he's going to talk a lot, so we'll try to rein him in. There will be time for audience questions, and we'll make sure there's time for audience questions. And afterwards, Abbas will be signing copies of his book outside. And I really encourage you all to get it because it is a really gripping and exciting story. Now, tonight, is it okay if we begin with a short reading?
Yes.
Is that all right?
Yep, no, that's perfect. And firstly, thank you all for coming along tonight. I thought I was the draw card for the opening night, but then I had a taste of the Astrolab Rosé out there, and I can see why everyone came through tonight. So thank you all for joining us. This is one of my favorite passages in the book, and I think it's a perfect place to start. A year later, we were sitting at dinner one night when Dad announced the news that would change our lives forever. We're leaving. We cannot stay here anymore. There's a deafening silence as his words hung in the air. It wasn't a surprise. It was the spring of 2001 and the Taliban were firmly in charge of Afghanistan. They had just destroyed the great Buddhas of Bamiyan and set about massacring the Hazara living underneath their shadow. By then, more than half of the homes in our village of Sangjoy had been boarded up and abandoned. Our once thriving village was dying as if felled by a deadly blight. Every day we noticed more classmates absent. Worse, some nights we could hear the thunder of automatic gunfire from the valleys close by, shattering the tranquility we had once known. As every day passed, death crept closer. And the reason I chose that as the opening passage is one step back. This picture was taken by myself in 2012 when I went back to Afghanistan for the first time since we had left. It's my village. I took this photo standing atop a hill looking down on the village of Sangjoy. And I thought it was so appropriate to begin here because it kind of completely dismisses any notion of what most people think of when they think of Afghanistan, right? You think of plains and deserts, and while that's true of some parts of the country, this is where I'm from, right? And it's very similar to Central Otago, and maybe a little bit, Marlborough as well. Incredibly hot, dry summers, snow-capped mountains and blistering cold winters. Some days would wake up with snow right above the door line of our house, right? And it's so different to what most people think. And that passage kind of, like I said, the situation in 2001, we had tranquility and peace in our little village, but it was shattered, right? And we didn't want to leave, but yet, there was a new force, a new government in power, and now we were compelled to leave our home.
So even though your book is called After the Tampa, there is quite a lot that's before the Tampa as well, which I found incredibly interesting because I realised I knew much less about Afghanistan than I thought I did, even though obviously it's been in the news for my entire life. Now, would you talk to us a bit to explain something you say in the book, that Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic, multilingual country, and that your group is Hazara, which is 10 to 20% of the population. Now, Hazara have been persecuted since the 19th century in the Iron Emir. This was all new to me. So would you give us some context, please?
Yeah, that's right. Something that I find incredible is how Afghanistan has been plastered across, TV and media and newspapers and had so much coverage, and yet there is still so little understanding of the dynamics on the ground there. So to kind of give you the 2-minute, history lesson, Afghanistan, by sheer, fortune or misfortune of its geography, has been at the behest of different kinds of powers and militaries and ideologies that have swept, humanity essentially, dating all the way back to the times of Alexander the Great, right, whose empire stretched right to the edge of what is now known Afghanistan. His first wife was a lady from what is now Afghanistan. They called it Bactria back then. And then multiple empires over the years. I often joke that Genghis Khan is my great uncle, right? The Mongolian Empire also swept through. And when there's different groups of people, it forms all of those things that we love about an ancient civilization. All of the things that we travel to Europe for on our holidays, right? The cuisine, the culture, the history, the architecture, the literature, all of those things. Afghanistan and that part of the world is full of that. But also, when you've got multiple groups of people vying for control of a certain area, sadly, it often also leads to conflict. And that is why violence has kind of been etched into the DNA of that particular area of the world that would later become the modern country of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, I describe it like a patchwork quilt of different groups of people that live and trade and socialize and make the fabric of the country. They look different, they speak multiple different languages and dialects, worship differently, they have their own culture and customs, and by and large, they get along. But every time there is a change of power or a new force comes into being, those ethnic and sectarian cleavages, they really start to become very prominent. And like you mentioned, my people, the Hazara, which is like 15-20% of the population, right? We're probably by whatever measure you use, maybe third, fourth largest ethnic group, and we've always felt the sharp end of the stick when it comes to a change in whoever is in charge. And I detail in the book, some of the history of oppression and later genocide that took place against the Hazara peoples of Afghanistan, right? So our heritage, ethnically and genetically, we look different. We have Central Asian genetics. We speak a different language. We speak Dari, which is a dialect of Persian, right, which is what they speak in Iran. And we worship differently in that we're Shia Muslim versus the majority Sunni Muslim, and we live in certain parts of the country, particularly the central highlands of Afghanistan. And so very distinct in that regard. And that's why whenever there's been a change in power, it's like very easy to point at the person who looks and speaks and worships differently as the scapegoat.
Now, when your father made that call, dramatic call for you to leave, your oldest brother had already been sent away, and would you explain why?
Yeah, that's right. My older brother, when the Taliban took over in 94, it took them about 18 to 24 months to pretty much take over 90% of the country. Not by land area, but by population. Afghanistan's so mountainous, it's very hard to control the whole country, but you can take over individual cities. And there were pockets of resistance initially. They were kind of quickly wiped out and stamped out. And there was, Hazara kind of rebellion or militia. But, we're being so at the bottom of the heap when it comes to getting resources or having connections or all the rest of it. We couldn't put up much of a fight. And so every kind of military-aged male, right, anyone kind of 14 or 15 up, if you were caught out there on the highways, or if you were put, at a boundary or a pit stop or a checkpoint by the Taliban, and you look different, you can't cover that up. You look very Asiatic in appearance. If you were caught by the Taliban, at the very least, you'd get a severe beating, but on more occasions than not, they'd probably be killed, shot, put on the side of the road to be made an example of. And so when my older brother Hussein, when he was of age, he just turned 15, 16, Dad said, "You got to leave the country," and smuggled him out of the country into Iran, into neighboring Iran, yeah.
And there are a lot of Hazara in Iran, yes? That's
right. So, refugee outflows out of Afghanistan are, in the millions, but disproportionately it is Hazara that make up that refugee population, particularly because you go into Iran, just cross the border west into Iran or east into Pakistan, and there's very large Hazara populations in both those countries, numbering in the 1 to 2 million range. Yeah.
Often doing drudgery and living terrible existences, yes.
Yeah, that's right, because those countries, they're not signatories to the UN Refugee Convention. Some of the governments, depending on the economic state of their own country at the time, if they're doing really well, then their generosity might increase, so they turn a blind eye to the existence of these illegals, as they refer to them. But then if there's some political event that they want to kind of use to their advantage, right, they'll say, no, it's these guys' fault, all these people that are out here camping in our streets or whatever. And so they have no right to work, to live, to have their kids go to school or whatever, even if their kids or their children were born, or even if they marry with a local Iranian or Pakistani woman and have children there, they still aren't seen as rightful citizens. So not only are they denied those rights, but their children, so multiple generations of Afghan refugees living in Iran and Pakistan, they still live as second-class citizens. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the Taliban before and looking different. One of the great and exciting and dangerous moments in the book is when your family is trying to get out of Afghanistan. Your father's beard is assessed by a member of the Taliban.
Yeah, that's right. The Taliban they're very they're very literal people. Like their whole mantra, their whole doctrine when they came over to take Afghanistan, and I say came over, pointedly, because the Taliban actually, their base of ideology, their base of financing, their foundation, their military headquarters, all their leadership are actually based across the border in Pakistan. And so these guys were imported or exported out of Pakistan into Afghanistan. They're not a homegrown movement. Their foot soldiers are, disenchanted young men, usually farmers from very rural tribal areas of Afghanistan who see no other point, so they pick up the arms and they join out of excitement and the opportunity to, earn a bit of money. But the thought, the foundations, all of that is kind of imported from across the border. And so their whole ideology, their whole doctrine was to, quote, make Islam great again, right? They wanted to establish a new country. So, sorry, just to take 10 steps back, the Taliban are the latest iteration in a century-long debate and discussion about the role and the glory of the Muslim world. You see, following World War I, The Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire, Islamic empire, they collapsed. Right, there was nothing left. And so a lot of Islamic scholars said, why have we collapsed? We were once such great powers. What is the reason for our decline? What is our role in the world? And so over the decades, over the 20th century, different thoughts emerged. Different thoughts emerged to explain that, to try and answer that question. And by the 60s and 70s, the thought that was starting to really entrench itself was by a bunch of scholars out of Egypt and the Middle East who said that the reason that the Islamic world is in decline is because the way Islam is being practiced at all levels of society, in business, in trade, in governance, in the way our society is structured, is that we have strayed too far from the path. We have strayed too far from how it was practiced when it was initially brought to the people, in the 7th century. And in order for us to reclaim our glory and our role in the world, we need to live and trade and structure society as it was 1400 years ago. And that was starting to take shape, and it eventually morphed into a militant movement where they said if the governments themselves won't start becoming more conservative, then it needed to be done by force. So there's you had the Islamic Revolution of Iran, right? And then you had a number of events throughout the 70s in Saudi Arabia. And so the Taliban were the latest iteration that say, yeah, we are a militant force and we will do this by force. So they came over, took over the country and said, we are establishing a caliphate, which is, what it was in the 7th century. And we're going to live and work as we did back then. And that's why they came in. And overnight, you had the change of government. You had a different name. You had a different flag, different anthem. And that's when the eyes of the Western world started opening up to that, right? That's where you had things like the kite runner, right, which opened up the eyes of many to what it was like then. And overnight, right, you had the all-covering female burqa, which was synonymous with Afghanistan. But that wasn't the norm prior. It wasn't something that was, something that existed. I mean, sure, it might have in the rural areas, but it definitely wasn't as ubiquitous as it became. Women weren't allowed to leave the home, right? Girls banned from education. Any female that left the home without a male chaperone, could have been beaten or arrested. You had incredibly barbaric law and order where maybe perhaps if you were caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local markets, you'd have your hand amputated. If you'd committed some other bigger crime, you might be put in the middle of the local football or cricket ground and stoned to death to be made an example of to the tens of thousands of others. It was incredibly barbaric. And so getting back to the point about the beard, right, there were very literal people that look at the text and say, yep, this is how it was done, so we're going to do that. And so there's some text that says that a man's beard should be a fist long. So like dads, we're Asian in genetics. I'm very proud of this, that I can do this. Dad definitely can't, and so his beard was much shorter, and so the Taliban put his fist under his chin and said it has to come out from underneath the hand. That's how long it has to be. And I think he got a free pass because he said, you Hazara can't grow beards that well. So, but that's a small but funny and also incredibly scary experience to go through.
Really scary thing.
Yeah.
Now you escaped to Pakistan.
Yeah.
Though I was not convinced you would be able to during the reading of your book. But then how did you end up in Indonesia in a boat that was not seaworthy with 400 other people? How did you get there?
It's a really good question, and I'm going to skip over the details to leave enough interest for people to go buy my book at the end of tonight's talk, right? Shout outs to the Paper Plus team.
We could just gloss over it altogether.
Yeah, let's just
if you
gloss
want,
over it. We'll go straight to the signing.
It's very dangerous and exciting.
Yeah.
But let's talk about...
No, let's do it.
Sure?
So we find ourselves in a refugee camp on the outskirts of a city called Quetta, Pakistan. Quetta is a city of over 1 million people. And throughout the late 90s, more and more refugees, mostly Hazara Afghans, have crossed the border and established almost like an informal settlement, which becomes like a tent city on the outskirts of Quetta. And it just through talking to other people and other family members and relatives and friends of friends, people kind of know that, hey, maybe there's other families here, we might be able to find refuge or connection or whatever. So Quetta becomes kind of the meeting point. And so we find ourselves here living in this tent city outside Quetta. And when you're a refugee, you kind of, your choices are very obvious. You've got two choices, right? Which is one, you might wait it out in whatever accommodation or shelter that you have, right? Be it a tent city, be it informal accommodation with relatives, be it whatever. You wait it out and you hope that the situation in your home country improves so that you can go back, return, pick up your life, resume your business, get back to work. Right, that's one option. And the clear question with that is who knows when or how long that might be. And the perfect example of this is if you look at the situation facing Ukrainians right now. When they packed up 3 or 4 months ago when the missiles started falling down on Kiev, I wondered when those parents were packing up their lives, did they think, I'll be back next week or next month, or I'll be back before Christmas? Who knows when or if they will be ever able to be returned. And now they're sheltering in Poland or wherever else in Eastern Europe. Same with the Syrians, right? In 2011 when that civil war kicked off, maybe when these families fled into neighboring Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon, maybe they thought, shit, have I turned the oven off, right? Am I going to come back next week or next month? And now 12 years later, that war is still raging on. So that's the obvious problem with choice one. You can wait, who knows how long. And option two is that you apply to the UN and you hope for resettlement overseas, right? You apply, hopefully you get shortlisted, you're interviewed, you provide evidence, you go through the entire span of works required. But the sheer situation is that it's a supply-demand issue, right? Then the supply of refugees keeps going up, civil conflict and climate change, and the demand for refugees goes down because these countries, obviously, it's not a very attractive thing to be bringing in these refugees, right, politically. And so 0.1% of refugees are resettled overseas. So the average wait time from application to maybe, assuming you get a positive answer, is about 15 years, right? And that's the situation facing these people, right? Mum, dad, couple of kids. Those are your two choices, right? Wait it out or wait it out. And so naturally, you spoke about how we got to Indonesia. You look for another way out. You look for another path forward. If you have the risk tolerance, if you have the means, financial and otherwise, you look for some other path forward. And back then, through whispers and rumors of speaking with other people in the refugee camps, that other path forward was to physically get yourself on the shores of a foreign country. Literally arrive on foot, by boat, whatever, to a country and say, can you please hear me out? And for whatever reason, in 2001, that was Australia. I recently did a book tour of Australia last month, and someone asked, hey, Abbas, why did your family choose Australia? Was it because, we had just hosted the 2000 Sydney Olympics, right? And Australia looked super attractive on TV. And I said, no, it wasn't that. We didn't have time to watch the 2000 Olympics, but we did see an ad on TV with a lovely lady in a bikini that asked, where the bloody hell are you? And that kind of convinced us we have to go there, it looks great. No, there was no real science or logic or rationale behind it. It was, if you draw a circle around Pakistan, right, 5,000-6,000 kilometers wide, the nearest country that's a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention is Australia in the South Pacific or Western Europe. And that's it. You either go overland and try to get into Europe, or you go by sea and try to get to Australia. And that's why that was chosen in 2001. And so again, cutting the story short, we make our way and get ourselves to Indonesia and living again undocumented in these refugee camps. Not so much a refugee camp, but just kind of in this abandoned warehouse, I don't know what to call it. One night in the middle of the night, get woken up, and the handlers that we were dealing with, say tonight's the night, a boat had been found. And we all get bundled up into this minivan and driven through Jakarta, right? We're on the outskirts of Jakarta, through the jungle, out to the shoreline. It's pitch black, you can't see anything. And then sure enough, more and more van loads of people keep arriving. It's a huge hub of activity. It's pitch black, you can't see anything. You can kind of hear the crashing of the waves. And, the handlers say, there it is, pointing to this, this fully serviced P&O cruise line that was going to take us, it's going to take us across the Indian Ocean. It was this, this rickety old wooden fishing boat that was tied up to some rocks with some bits of rope. And there it is again, right? That's your decision point number 2. Here before you is this vessel that may or may not get you to your point of salvation and the chance to rebuild and reset your life, assuming it survives, right? So you get on and you hope for the best. Or you don't get on and you are a stateless family with no papers, no rights, in a foreign country. You could end up begging or homeless on the streets of Jakarta. Right, that's decision point number 2, right? I talked about decisions there, right, of having forced to leave our village, of then forced to leave the refugee camp, and now we've got another intersection to navigate. And that particular chapter in the book was incredibly hard to write. One, I had to speak to my parents about it and ask for them to relive that conversation that they had as they were literally tossing up whether they climbed the ropes onto the boat. But 2, it's very hard for me to get that right in terms of the words and the emotions for readers like yourselves, because, we'll never have to face that question, right? We'll never have to face that situation. Just to kind of, how can you, holding your child to your breast, decide, yep, I'm going to get on this boat? It's an impossible situation to be in. And sadly, it's the reality for so many people. It's a sad reality for so many people who are just fleeing desperation. One of the saddest things to come out of the European migrant crisis was, all of those bodies that wash ashore on the beautiful, Italian and Greek beaches. How can you, as a mother, as a father, climb on board this boat knowing that you might drown in the Mediterranean? But I guess this book kind of highlights what people are actually fleeing, right? And it opens up the eyes of so many to the sheer desperation that's out there. And that's why we managed to get ourselves on that boat.
Well, the boat, without giving anything away, because the Tampa story is a very famous one, the boat was not seaworthy, and after a storm it was going down. Now, you were rescued by a Norwegian boat, the Tampa.
That's right. Oh, man. We survived the night of the storm, and we scanning our situation, surveying the wreckage of our boat, looking out. This is on the 3rd day in the open water in the Indian Ocean, trying to figure out where to next. There's no power, no propulsion. And everyone just kind of said, this might be it, right? I say that lightly. And we're scanning the horizon in the late afternoon. There's a small black dot that's piercing the line between the sky and the sea. Everyone's hollering and shouting, holding up their children, waving, all this sort of stuff. And it starts getting, we don't know if it's going away or coming towards us, but it becomes obvious it's coming towards us, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and we can make it out, right? It's this giant container ship. You guys know how big those things are. They're massive, right? And it's hurtling directly towards us, to the fact that we don't even know if it's seen us, right? It's this big. And then, finally it does an arc, turns around, and it's clearly seen us. It pulls up right next to us, and we've just been rescued. We were rescued by the MV Tampa, hence the name of the book, and what would be later known as the Tampa Affair. The Tampa was this 260-meter long behemoth of a container ship that was the pride jewel of the Norwegian Wilhelmsen shipping line. It was going from Fremantle in Western Australia up to Singapore, and it just diverted course to come and rescue us. And 2 sailors come down the 12 flights of stairs, jump on board our boat. For many people, it was the first white person they had seen, and this guy, First Officer Christian Molto, is every bit the Scandinavian, right? 6'6", blonde, blue eyes, right? We can't speak a word of English, but we don't need to be told, up you get. We start climbing these stairs. Nothing, right? No personal possessions, no luggage, nothing, because it would slow down the process. And as this rescue operation is happening, the boat keeps getting slammed up against the metal hull of the ship, and it's starting to fall into pieces. And as we're getting up, another sailor at the top writes a number on our wrist to try and figure out how many people had been rescued. And the final number was 438. And I'm told tonight there's a little over 300 people here, right? 433 mostly Hazara Afghan asylum seekers, 5 Indonesian crew. And as the last person, as First Officer Christian Malto went downstairs, checked to see everyone's clear, as he jumped off the little boat, that thing sank, and it's now sitting at the bottom of the Indian Ocean with all of the possessions that people had brought with them to begin their new life. But we had just been rescued. And we were rescued by this Norwegian captain, Captain Arnie Renan, who would later go on to win numerous bravery awards by the United Nations. And so begins this illustrious event known as the Tampa affair. Some of you may recall it from the time. Some of you may recall seeing it on TV and just seeing that red boat out in the water. And this book kind of helps me square that away and tell our story, because it became such a big story, but not for a minute throughout that entire saga were we able to tell our story, because it was so stage managed by the Prime Minister's office in Canberra. They didn't want to humanize it. They didn't want to see the faces of these desperate families, because other Australian families, if they were to see babies, and if they were to see women, and if they were to see children, be like, man, they kind of look a little bit like us. So it was incredibly stage managed. We might as well have been on another planet. There was no contact with the outside world. We were boarded by 50 SAS soldiers, fully kitted. That was our welcoming party. Fully kitted, armed to the teeth, to expect a hostile reception. And that was all stage managed by the Prime Minister's office in Canberra. Now, I delve into the politics behind that. But the point of it was this. And when I was asked to write this book, it was because throughout that entire saga, all people saw was the red container ship out there in the water. And it was portrayed as a national security threat. It was portrayed, the words being used by the press and the Prime Minister's office were incredibly dehumanizing and othering, right? Illegals, boat people, a brown wave, a national security threat, aliens. Not one time will we ever see a picture of a face of someone on board, a name, a personal statement, or a story, and it was done strategically and calculatedly to completely dehumanize it all, just to sanitize it all up. And this was a chance for us to tell our story.
Now, I'm conscious of time, and so we're going to just move forward a little bit, but to say that 300 or so of you from the Tampa ended up in Nauru, some of you for 3 years.
That's right.
But your family was one of the ones brought to New Zealand, the invitation of Helen Clark. And could you talk about the experience of first arriving in Auckland? I know that when New Zealand was mooted, that some of your fellow refugees said, "What is New Zealand? Who is he? Are we going to get to meet him?" Yeah. New Zealand was not a bikini on television.
No,
you really didn't know what you were expecting, no?
No, not at all. We were kept out in the open ocean for up to 5 weeks while the Tampa saga, the standoff, continued. And the New Zealand government says, look, we can't let this go on. We'll take on some of those people. And we'll take those of them in family units, right? Mum and dad and kids and any underage kids traveling alone. And that was a turning point in my life, right? We spent 1 day on Nauru, and then an Air New Zealand charter plane came and picked us up and brought us to Mangere, the refugee resettlement centre in South Auckland. September 27, 2001. 9/11 had happened while we were out in the open ocean, and we had no idea about it because of how enclosed we were. We saw the images of it when we arrived to Auckland. And those who weren't lucky enough to fit the criteria that New Zealand had placed They were the first inmates in Australia's policy of offshore detention. Some of them would spend up to 3, 4, 5 years in prison, 40-degree heat, 100% humidity, on a rock in the Pacific. Right? Nauru is essentially one giant old phosphate mine. But life for us, it took a turn, right? How lucky were we? We did our 6-week orientation program at Mangere, and then we were dispersed throughout the country, right? Through just resettlement, wherever social housing was available. And for me and about half of the other Tampa families that were rescued and resettled in New Zealand, that was going to be Christchurch. So we resettled to Christchurch just before Christmas 2001. And I just want to read a passage. I just want to read a passage. So we had just finished our program, and we arrive, get flown down to Christchurch, and this is us as we're about to walk into our state house, right, our new home after being on the road for 9 months since we had left little old Sangjoy. Paradise was a state house on Ballantyne Avenue in Upper Riccarton, with a white picket fence, a vibrant green front yard, a fireplace complete with a brick chimney, and a cream weatherboard exterior. Every family had a team of volunteers pick them up from the airport. These were everyday Kiwis who had replied to a Red Cross ad in the local paper. They had received some training for RMS, Refugee and Migrant Services, an agency that would be a critical support for us over the next few years. Half a dozen volunteers had been assigned to the Nazari clan. There was Ola and Gavin and Prue, Colin, and our favourites, Chris and Jan. These volunteers would become an integral part of our lives. On that first journey, our volunteers drove along Memorial Ave to Ilam Road, to Church Corner, and finally to Ballantyne Ave, a tree-lined street with a row of neat houses set back from the road. Walking through the blue front door into our new home was like emerging from underwater and taking a huge gulp of air. We were a long way from our thatched roof, mud brick homestead in Sangjoy. I can only imagine what it must have been like for my parents. The feeling of being rescued by the Tampa, of then arriving to New Zealand, and then of being resettled and given the keys to our house in Christchurch, it is so hard to describe. I was a little kid at the time, and I was just in wonder. And when I was writing this book, I was just trying to imagine myself in my parents' shoes, having them actively make the decision at every step of the way. And now for that to finally pay off and see us safe and secure and warm and dry, I can only imagine, right? And there are many parents in the room. I hope you empathise with that feeling.
And you talk very movingly, I think, about all the support that your family was given, including something at Hagley College, a homework club. Would you tell us about that? Was it just for refugee families?
It was for ethnic and migrant kids, essentially. Basically, so I learned my ABCs as a little 9-year-old boy at the Refugee Resettlement Centre in Mangere, and then went to primary school, and we started off in ESOL and then gradually tested out and went mainstream. We knew nothing of the language in New Zealand, right? None of us spoke a word of English. And then there was this after-school program called the Homework Club. I think it was a government-funded program, and it's still continuing to this day at Hagley College in Christchurch, where kids of ESOL backgrounds, not just refugee backgrounds, but ESOL kids can go after school twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, get help with their homework and get that extra little boost and accelerator so they can improve their language. That was an enormous pathway for us, right? And as you mentioned in the intro, right, later on I'd go and place third in the New Zealand National Spelling Bee, and that was a feel-good moment too.
Didn't your picture end up in a newspaper in Afghanistan?
That's right, I did this thing for the press and someone picked it up, and I think some years later my uncle, who was still living in Afghanistan, he said, I think I recognize this boy. And this was at the time when we didn't have WhatsApp or on our phones, managed to somehow get our number here, and he said, did your boy win some spelling bee or whatever? And it was he was in the middle of Afghanistan nowhere, and somehow it made the papers over there, right? What a awesome little experience. But you're right, just on that point though, about service and wraparound help. There are so many agencies out there who did help us. Refugee and Migrant Services, the Red Cross, volunteers, the Homework Club, our teachers, our interpreters and translators for agencies such as Language Line. All of those things go so far in making that transition easier. Because when we arrived to this country, we didn't have anything. Like I said, when we were rescued by the Tampa, we literally just had the clothes on our backs, right? No paperwork, no bags, not even personal belongings, right? I remember distinctly I didn't have shoes on, which I'd later regret very much on the hot metal deck of the Tampa for 5 weeks, right? My feet were that thick, blistered. But we arrived here and we were wrapped by support. Of course, there's going to be people who complain that it's not culturally sensitive enough, or people aren't trained up enough, or there's shortages here and there, or whatever. Those complaints will always be there. But the fact that there are people who put their hand up and say, I'll take them to the doctor's appointment, I'll take them to show them the bus timetable, I'll take them to their footy games, that means a hell of a lot. That means so much.
Will you tell the audience about one thing that had to be explained to your family, which was the letterbox?
Letterbox. I mean, we don't have letterboxes in Afghanistan, right? If there's a sale on at the local market, it's done through word of mouth. Nobody has flyers that arrive in the mail. And so we had a letterbox at 23 Ballantyne Ave. No idea what it was for, but every day we'd go to school and come back and it would be filled with paper. Now, who the hell is filling up our letterbox with this stuff? Can't even read English. And then we collected all of this, put it up in the boxes, right? And at the end of the week, when Jan, our volunteer, would come and help us out, take us to the park, she'd see the kitchen bench was full of this. She's like, you know you can throw this out. I said, why? It must be important. Well, who's sending us all these letters? And it was all just, Pack and Save and New World and coupon books and all the rest of it, right? Small stuff like that, when I think back on it now, man, I laugh. But it was so foreign to us at the time. It was so foreign, right? But, man, it's awesome that we went through that, right? Because we laugh about it, but they're such formative experiences, and it'll stick with me forever.
There's a line in the musical Hamilton. It's immigrants, we get the job done.
Yeah.
And reading about your family, and also not just your family, but friends, other people in your community, the number of jobs people had, the raspberry picking every summer, the children getting up at dawn to help the family. And I was thinking about you when you had your first real job in the Treasury, working as a policy analyst in Wellington. And on Friday and Saturday nights, you drove a taxi.
That's right.
And on Saturday during the day, you went to the family business, Auto Wreckers, and did paperwork.
Yeah.
That work ethic, was it really ingrained in you by your parents?
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that I get from people who read my book is that it gives them a greater sense of perspective on the refugee and immigrant experience in New Zealand. And that perspective is one of the main reasons why I wrote this book, because sadly, the perspective of refugees is quite negative, not just in this country, but just generally, right? The way it's portrayed is that these guys they're not skilled, they're a weight on the welfare system, that they are cutting ahead in front of genuine Kiwis, etc., etc. That perspective is pervasive. And so for me, one of the main reasons why I wrote this book was to tell our story and say, yeah, we arrived here, and we needed to have our hand held and be spoon-fed every step of the way. But finally, after a couple of years, we learned to stand up on our own feet and become independent and regain our agency and start to contribute back, learn the language, get accustomed and integrated into the culture, become educated and employed and set up businesses and just get after it, right? And just really take the opportunity with both hands. And that was, my experience, what you just described, right? But there are so many others, right? The first interaction that most, Kiwis get with people of a refugee or immigrant background is, taxi driving. It's a classic, right? My dad did it, my uncles did it, because it's the simplest job you can get. All you have to do is drive. And they all begin there. And hopefully you save up a bit of money so that maybe you can open a dairy, right? The next kind of easiest job. And then you learn to step up, and then the kids after that, then they have the financial base, they own their own home, then the kids can go off to uni and do whatever. It's a stepping stone. The first generation lays down the foundations, second generation then builds the rest of the house, and it all flourishes from there. And the work ethic is so strong, like you said, it's ingrained in me through my parents because they worked so hard, right? I remember summers as a kid, raspberry picking, right? Fruit picking, huge fan of that because I went through that, and one, you'd earn a bit of money, but two, you'd learn how valuable the essence of hard work is, right? You get up at the crack of dawn when you don't want to. Then you go and you pick fruit for the whole day when the rest of your friends are out there having the time of their lives. It gives you that sense of perspective. And that's why I didn't hold back. I could have easily avoided telling that story here because it might have made us look desperate or unskilled or whatever. But I wanted to say, yep, this is what we went through and we did it. And maybe we didn't like it at the time, but boy, am I glad that I actually did it.
I was really impressed with that. And didn't you say it was through raspberry picking that your family was able to buy their first car?
That's right. We bought this thing that was already as ancient as like a Greek chariot, right? It's already on its last legs and ran around for a couple of years and it finally gave up the ghost. And then this was at the time, early 2000s, right, before smartphones. You put an ad in the paper or whatever, and hopefully someone will come and buy this junk and take it out of your driveway. And nobody did. And we put like a for free sign on the window, and nobody was interested. And Dad got real sick of it and said, surely, there must be a market in this, right? And he called up a scrap dealer and said, hey man, how much are you going to buy this thing off me for scrap? He's like, oh, you bring it over and we'll charge you $500 to get rid of it. And he thought, bloody hell, there's got to be a better way. And Dad's quite an entrepreneur, right? And he said, maybe there's a market for second-hand car parts overseas. So he rings around his friends over there and he says, do you think if we shipped car parts to you guys, you could sell it to the Middle East, right? And from there it can go all over. And he's like, oh my God, yeah, because people over there, they can't afford a new Hilux or whatever, but they might be afford a new motor to keep their current Hiluxes going for a few more decades, right? And so we set up this thing. Kiwi Car Removals was born in a little warehouse on Montreal Street in Christchurch. My dad and 5 other Tampa families, right, the heads of the households, we had a bit of money and we all pulled together our life savings. And they didn't know anything about business in New Zealand. None of the qualifications, none of the legislation, the regulation, all of that. They just went at it, right? At the crack of dawn, right up until midnight, just getting after it, dismissing all the paperwork, which then I'd have to come clean up. But they got after it, and Kiwi Car Removals grew into this massive beast. And now, we're based in Wellington and we employ, 45 people, and it's just an incredible, incredible story. And I talk about that in my book, The Kiwi Dream, right? It helps that New Zealand has the oldest car fleet in the OECD, right? I think that has a big part to help. But man, it was tough in those early years, right? You're setting up a business in a foreign country where maybe you can't even speak the language up to 20% fluency. Take a risk, you put in the hours, and it pays off. And that's kind of the entire story.
Well, there's one element of that story, and that's to do with your oldest brother. Would you tell us about how Hussein was able to come here?
Yeah, so when we made the journey to leave Sangjoy, and it took us almost 9 months to eventually be resettled to New Zealand, my oldest brother Hussein wasn't with us. We'd sent him to Iran the year before. And, he never went through something I always give him shit for, right? You didn't come here on a boat. But when he never went through that, and we were finally resettled to New Zealand, as happy and as joyous as that experience was for my parents, right? The eldest son wasn't there. And so after getting our citizenship, we were able to apply for family reunification. And he had to get all his medicals and all of the pieces of paper and the documents together, because he was also living illegally in Iran, right? He didn't have any rights. But he managed to get that together, and he was finally granted a visa. And he also had to do the 6-week orientation program at Mangere. And the day he walked out of that camp, my mum and dad stood outside the gates for him to walk out, and the 3 of them got on the flight back to Christchurch, and it was just, we were whole again after so long, right? And our Valentine Ave, our house was already a magical place, but it took on a new energy when we were all whole again. It was just the perfect ending. Yeah.
And he finally took over the business from
yeah,
your father.
and him and my other older brother Sam, they run the two directors of our business in Lower Hutt. I know we're in Blenheim, but if ever you guys need car parts, all right, we do ship nationwide, all right? Kiwi car removals, you won't forget it. Yeah.
We have lots more to talk about, but I'm conscious that we're going to go to questions in a moment. Now, when we do go to questions, because this is being recorded, there is a mic that you can speak into, and so please speak into the mic.
Yes.
But before we go to questions, I just would like to ask you, so the mics are bearing down on you. Please gather your thoughts. And remember, questions only, no comments. You were in Christchurch the day of the mosque shootings, and you were in fact outside one of the mosques, and someone who was a very good friend of your family was in fact the first victim. Could you just talk a little bit about that experience of that day for you?
March 15th, 2019, it was a Friday afternoon. I remember 2 days really, really well, right? I remember the earthquakes in Christchurch. I was in high school at the time. I remember it so well. Tuesday, 12:51, and March 15th, 2019. I was just down there. I was living in Wellington at the time. I was just down there because me and some mates were going to go do some hiking through Arthur's Pass National Park, right? So I arrived there that morning, was having lunch with my sister, get this alert on my phone, active shooter in Christchurch, and we just kind of ignore it. And then another alert, active shooter in a mosque in Christchurch, and it's just the most hard to describe that feeling. And we were just having lunch down the road, so I kind of sprinted down because I knew there would be members of our community there. Not particularly my family, but I knew there would be members of the wider Afghan community there. And sure enough, we got there and it was just, all hell had broken loose, right? There was cops and media and, family members, and everyone was screaming and shouting, and we had no idea the extent of the damage at the time. And then it would later become obvious, right, how horrendous it was. It's real hard to describe that day because it shook this entire country, right? It just, oh man. When I recall that day and how peaceful it began, right? I was just having lunch and all of a sudden the whole day was just shattered. And then that night we have like a community meeting at one of the elders' house, and everyone's just pouring out their heart. Will I leave my daughter and my wife to leave home, right? They wear a headscarf. Do we need to have armed guards at our community centre from now on? How can I run my Middle Eastern bakery business now? Will I get targeted? It was just a horrendous conversation to be having. Everyone was and these were natural concerns to have. People have been living there for 20 years, and someone said, this is not the New Zealand that I know. How could this happen? And talking about perspective before, one of the elders got up and he said, I understand where you guys are coming from, but can I tell you something? And he says, when we arrived to Mangere off the Tampa, we went through customs, they put us on a bus, and as we're heading into the Mangere refugee camp, the person driving the bus, he closed the curtains inside, and someone says, we just arrived in a new country. We'd arrived in the middle of the night. We'd been at customs the whole night. The sun was rising. It's almost a symbolically new day for us. Of course, we want to see the country that we just arrived into. And he says, no, we've heard intelligence that there might be protesters and people throwing eggs or stuff, because they don't want you guys here, because this was 3 weeks after 9/11. And we said, oh, wow, okay. And he says, silent bus ride to the refugee resettlement centre. And then on the final corner, as we stretch into the gates, someone peeps outside because there's a bit of hollering outside, and there's a couple of guys there, signs and waving and shouting. It didn't affect us; we couldn't speak English. And there's a couple of people, and it's starting to drizzle a little bit. And then we get into the refugee centre, and it's, we're welcomed by the most lavish welcome, the biggest feast we had ever seen, beautiful porphyry ceremony. All the staff were welcoming, embraced us with hugs, and went to our rooms, and there was blankets and donated food, and clothes. Finally, we could change our damn clothes. And he said, guys, in this moment of darkness, there's going to be a hell of a lot of questions, right? But in this moment, do we choose to focus on the two individuals that day who tried to rain on our parade? Or do we choose to focus on those hundreds of staff members who tried to welcome us and give us the welcome that we deserve? And this was right off the bat. So in that moment, do we choose to focus on the actions of one individual? Or do we choose to focus on how this city and this country is coming together? And that's so powerful, and that's something that sticks with me to this day, right? How important and how powerful it is to maintain perspective. Thank you.
Before, no clapping. We've got to go to the audience for questions. You're not permitted to clap until... If anyone has a question, would you put your hand up so that someone with a mic can see you? It's quite... Everyone's in stunned silence at the moment.
As they're thinking, I was going to say, some of the books are pre-signed out there, and some of them some of them aren't signed in case you want to personally dedicate it to someone, but I'll be sticking around at the end of tonight to talk to all, so I'm in no rush. Yes.
Abbas, there's a question up here.
Please.
Ma'am, go ahead.
Thank you. Is it working?
I can hear you, and I'll repeat your question.
Yeah, go on.
What is the state of the Hazara now?
What is the state of the Hazara people now under the Taliban? When the Taliban took over last year, everyone had fears about their takeover. But the people, again, that often feel that the most were the Hazara people, right? Because we had suffered so much under the previous Taliban regime in the 90s. So we thought that they'd revert back to that. Their initial words in their conferences and their statements that they made, they wanted to give off at least the illusion that, no, we have changed, that we have modernized, and we have learned the mistakes of the past. But words, actions speak louder than words. And so within a few weeks after the media kind of died down and people moved on to other tragedies and conflicts around the world, Taliban have kind of resumed that same mentality and practices that they had in the 90s. And so the exodus out of Afghanistan continues, and again, it's disproportionately the Hazara people, because when they took over, one of the first things that they did was to divide up land and divvy it out to their own supporters. And the most fertile lands are, in the central highlands of Afghanistan, which receives a bit more rainfall, and it's the Hazara live there and cultivate and tend to their animals. And they came in and kind of gave people 7 days to essentially just pack up and leave. And where there was pockets of resistance, they were, met with brutal force. So long story short, it's almost like history is repeating itself, and Hazara Afghans make up the bulk of Afghan refugees.
Abbas, there's another question over here.
Tēnā koe, ko Niki ahau. Tēnā koe. In this mid-COVID world we find ourselves in, there's a lot of talk about shortage of people and labour, and I often say to my husband how crazy this is, that there are so many people, for want of a better word, a bit discarded around the world. With your experience and your studies and just your life, vision or hope of how we might be able to reconcile these issues?
Yeah, I think it's sad because, like you mentioned before, immigrants got an incredibly good work ethic, because we have seen what it is like to not have opportunity. Right, we were so starved of opportunity in our home countries that when we arrive in a country which has security and prosperity like New Zealand, we just soak it all up. That's why people are they'll just get into any job they can, and the simplest being, driving buses and taxis to working their way up. And one of the things I'm trying to do with this book is to say these guys aren't here to live on welfare and say, yeah, we've made it. It's to say that thank you for the opportunity, now it's time for me to give back and contribute. And I hope I've done that through this book and through my speaking engagements that I take on. But it's going to take a while for that mentality to shift, to say these guys are not a burden, but rather an investment that will pay off. And sure, it might take a couple of years, but it will pay off. And I just hope more and more Kiwis, not just New Zealanders, but people around the world open up their eyes to the reframing refugees as opportunities and people who will give back, right? And like I said before, I was in Australia on my book tour, and I was in this place outside of Melbourne in this kind of rural town, and they were screaming out for labourers, people to work in their food processing factories and that kind of thing. And the local mayor had set up a partnership with the state government that refugees who arrive to Melbourne, they'll be shipped out to this town. And boy, they had loved it. They absolutely loved it. They were immediately working at, of all places, the McCain's French fry, freezer works there, right? Doing the night shift and the day shift, and they were so happy about that. One, the refugees were happy. They had dignified work, and they were earning good money. And the employers were happy because they were now able to fill in that labour shortage. And I hope that there's more and more policies like that start to come around.
Abbas, there's a question up here. A gentleman up there.
I understand the Taliban are quite a ruthless organisation. But do you see, is there resistance amongst the Afghanis? And do you see a day when the Taliban will be kicked out by the Afghanis themselves? I mean, Russia's tried and failed, the US and so forth, but it's quite different, the home countrymen.
Yeah. Anyone who's tried to predict the future of Afghanistan has kind of failed and failed miserably, and I don't want to add my name to that list, but I guess my personal view of it is, and I'm forever the optimist, and again, this is just my personal bias, I feel like the Taliban kind of realized that perhaps they cannot rule the way they did the first time round. That in order for them to be at least welcomed by the international community as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, they need to soften up, and they need to give consolations, and they need to let go of some of their harder line policies. And I think there is a faction, just following on social media some Afghan journalists and commentators, there is a faction of the Taliban who realize that, who have grown up in the age of social media and are savvy enough to be able to read the room, who realize that, and they want to steer the party or the organization that way. But right now it's the hardliners, the people that fought and were commanders in the 90s, that are in firm control of the direction of the organization. And maybe there might be a toss-up or a fracture there at some point, but history has repeated itself, and it'll continue repeating itself, and I don't know when or if it might happen. On my last trip to Afghanistan in 2017, and I write about it in the book, I talked about an Afghanistan that could be, an Afghanistan that might have existed in a parallel universe, of an Afghanistan that is wealthy and able to tap into its natural resources, of which there are plenty, an Afghanistan that opens up itself to the world and reclaims itself as, like it was back in the days on the old hippie route, right? People used to go from London to New Delhi, some of you nodding their heads furiously because you probably did that, because it was open to the world and there was a massive tourism, and of course it's a beautiful country, and why not, right? Why not? How tragic it is that it is in that situation despite its potential. So I'm forever hopeful that it might happen, just don't know when.
Abbas, there's another question over here, and it might be our last question.
Make it good. Do that thing where they say, actually, I've got two questions.
I got one anyway. I think you were extraordinarily lucky to avoid the Nauru thing, and most of us were absolutely shocked that the Aussies would produce a concentration camp in Australia. I mean, we were brought up in concentration camps in Europe, and the thought that they'd do such a thing in Australia was shocking to most of us. On the other hand, the Aussies have always had I suppose us to a certain extent too, have had a fairly strong attitude about controlling immigration. And the Aussies are only a couple hundred miles from Indonesia, and they were starting to get lots and lots of boats coming across from Indonesia, and they had to make an example. And that Nauru crowd was the example, and it's worked quite well. Have you got any views on that?
Yes, yeah, and one, it's a fantastic question to finish off, and allow me a couple of minutes to kind of elaborate. You're right, there was a time when during the Vietnam War or the Indo-Chinese War, as Cambodians and people from Laos and Vietnam escaping the communist forces there, they jumped on boats to try and get to safer harbours, and the vast majority of them ended up in Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore and others, and a few went even further south through the Malacca Straits down and made their way to Indonesia, right? And when those first boats arrived, and that's where the term boat people came from, when those first boats arrived, they were welcomed by the Australian government and by the Australian community and the Australian political establishment. And they were welcomed with open arms, and I don't know the exact figure, but tens of thousands of mostly Vietnamese or Indo-Chinese people were welcomed to Australia. And they've gone on, and this was in the 60s, 70s, and now they're second, third generation Vietnamese Australians. But somewhere along the line, the politics shifted from one of welcome to one of kind of demonization. And like I said in the book, I did a bit of research into this, and started off in the 90s, right? The economy at the time wasn't roaring as it should, and just, with globalization, with open borders, the streets of the main cities of, Melbourne and Brisbane and Sydney, you walk down the street and you'll see a lot more foreign faces. You'll see a lot more Asians, you see a lot more brown faces, a lot more non-white faces. And that wasn't because of illegal immigration. It just, Australia opened up to the world and more, just normal, regular migration. And there was an element of politics there that didn't like that change that was happening. And while you couldn't close down the regular or the legal migration routes, you could very easily point and say it's these boat people that are arriving by boat. Even though figures-wise, right, it's less than maybe 2 or 3% of total arrivals at the time. Right now it's 0.01% or whatever it is. But it's very easy to pinpoint one boat carrying maybe a few dozen or 50 or 60 people versus the vast majority of people who arrive by plane. And so it became vilified. And like you said before, Australia does have a much more checkered history when it comes to immigration, right? The White Australia policy, right? Terra nullius, all of those things which I touch on in the book. So immigration it's a much more hotly contested issue over there. And I'm not going to start shy away from the fact that here in little old New Zealand, we're way further south, that boat arrivals will never be a reality in this country, and that the offshore detention policy has worked, right? We've imprisoned, well, not we, but the Australian government has imprisoned a few thousand people on Nauru, on Manus Island, on Christmas Island as a deterrence, and it has worked, and it's deterred people smugglers because they know that they can't get their goods overseas. But in doing so, it's come at a cost, right? There's the clear damage to your reputation, right? Of you essentially running these camps on foreign grounds, essentially Guantanamo, right? It's happening in our backyard. So it's come at a cost, but also it's double-pronged in that those refugees who are in Australia, who have made it to the mainland, they're second-class citizens, right? Here in New Zealand, if you arrive as a refugee, you get given permanent residency, and then you're put on the pathway to citizenship. And you can become a New Zealand citizen within 5 years, assuming you meet the character grounds and all the rest of it. But in Australia, if you arrive, you are never granted permanent residency. You get given this thing called a TPV, Temporary Protection Visa, which means that every 12 to 24 months you have to go and say, can I please stay on for another 2 to 4 years? And you have to prove yourself. And a thing as small as a speeding ticket or an unpaid fine is enough to deport you. And there are people who have been on TPVs for 20 years now, who every 2 years have to prove their Australianness to the Australian government. They have no sense of security. They could be deported in any minute now. And there's layers to that. The TPV is only one. So it's created this two-tiered society where refugees are not only vilified for trying to arrive, they're vilified even if they have already arrived. And that debate, I think, is now reaching a head. This new government that's just come in, they said we're going to be looking at those settings and hopefully putting these people on a pathway to citizenship. So to your point, though, I don't want to shy away from the fact that offshore detention has worked, but at what price?
I think this is a really good place to stop, Abbas. There's so much more we could talk about. I encourage you all to read the book if you haven't already. After we get our mics off, we'll bring Abbas through to sign copies, as he says. He's happy to personalise them for you for all Christmas and birthday needs. So please join me in thanking Abbas Nazari.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was Abbas Nazari speaking to Paula Morris at the 2022 Marlborough Book Festival. A big thanks to all the writers that have supported the festival, as well as the audiences that attended in person or listened online. If you'd like to learn more about the event, head over to marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. Thanks for listening.